Again, we are going to begin with the defense of the PhD thesis of Ana Caramuru Pessoa-Aubert entitled When the Body, Phenomenological Considerations for Listening to Animals in the Making of Their Rights. We'll start with the external members of this Viva panel. First, Professor Patrizia Monticelli from the University of São Paulo, then Professor Fábio Checaira from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, followed by Professor Johann Ach from the University of Münster, and finally the co-supervisor, Professor Thomas Gutmann, also from the University of Münster. And after that, I will pose our final question. Anna, you have 20 minutes to present your thesis. If you wish to share your slides or PowerPoint, please let me know. After your presentation, Professor Patrizia Monticelli will begin with her questions. I ask you to take notes, and then at the end of her intervention, you can answer. This will be the procedure we'll follow. I will not set a strict time limit for each professor to make their comments and critiques and questions to Ana Aubert. Please feel at ease in this regard. And finally, I kindly ask the audience not to unmute microphones during the session. At the end of the Viva, we'll need around 10 minutes to decide about Ana Caramuru Aubert's grade. During this time, I ask the audience to leave the room, and if you wish, you may return after 10 minutes. So thank you very much. Ana, the floor is yours.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to greet you all and to deeply thank my two supervisors, Professor Ana Paula Barbosa Forman, Professor Thomas Gutmann. Also greet and thank the members of the panel for taking the time of your busy schedules to read my dissertation and to be here. I really appreciate that. And without further ado, can you all see my presentation? Yes. Okay. So as you know, it's called When the Body. So this was inspired by Jigsaw writer Lindsay Hogan's poem, which is the first epigraph in the monograph. And the subtitle is Phenomenological Considerations for Listening to Animals in the Making of Their Rights. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter. In some parts, I'm going to be a little bit more detailed, but I'll try to be very, very brief. So first of all, here we have the first chapter, and I start with an argument that all humans would benefit from fighting off anthropocentrism and criticizing and rethinking the ways by which we exploit non-human animals, or beyond human animals, as I prefer to call them. So first of all, I work with intersectionality to argue that the different violences against, for instance, people with disabilities, or based on race or based on gender, they are deeply and in complicated manners also connected to the exploitation of animals and to speciesism. So all of those oppressions would somehow be entangled under this larger umbrella of this ideology called anthropocentrism. I also make a very pragmatic argument considering climate change and loss of biodiversity and deforestation and pollution and depletion of water resources, and how exploiting animals is bad for all of that. So yeah, within the present context, I would say it's very urgent that we think about these things. I then move to my argument, the central argument of this first chapter. And to give it some context, what I was trying to do from start was to find a less anthropocentric way to discuss animal rights, because it's very common for us to hear in the debate people arguing for for more important rights or for more value to be ascribed to those creatures who are more similar to the typical adult human being, right? So at first, inspired by Christine Korsgaard, and she has an essay that is, if I'm not mistaken, it's called Neither Persons Nor Things, or something on those lines. That's actually what I wanted to call my dissertation at first, because I thought that to move away from anthropocentrism, I had to move away from legal personhood too. I also read Manisha Dekka's proposition of a third category in the law. So instead of just having that legal traditional bifurcation between legal persons and legal things, we would have also legal beings. And that made sense for me in the beginning. But then as I got in touch with Visakurki's bundle theory of personhood, I realized that legal personhood is not about personhood in the descriptive sense, that is, having a certain degree of rationality, of rational autonomy, or a sense of the future, a sense of the self, but rather is about having enough fundamental rights that are recognized by the lawmaker. So the question then becomes, can animals be subjects of rights, and can they be legal persons? If we take the interest theory of rights, which understands that rights exist to protect interests rather than the will, and will in this very rational, right, understanding of autonomy, then we can think that because animals are sentient creatures, they have interests. And then another question that follows is, should the lawmaker respond to those interests in the form of rights? And how to do that, right? Because it's much easier to think about what interests humans may have and that we wish to protect by the law. And the lawmaker, of course, is representing society, and and everybody has this standpoint on what is to be done. But when it comes to animals, it can be more challenging, right? Because other species have different experiences and ways of being in the world. So how to do that? Importantly, I adopt this phenomenological posture, or a style of thinking inspired by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. And what I try to do is what you can see in this image to the left, which is to place myself as a researcher and suggest we all place ourselves that way when thinking about animal rights. As part of the world, as part of this messy, entangled web of life who share the same evolutionary history and who inhabit Earth and the world through our bodies and through our bodily senses. And all of us from different species hover over the same objects and refer to them and communicate through our bodily movements. And when we want to perceive animals and understand animals and interpret and give meaning to what animals are communicating, we need to understand that we're doing that as animals ourselves, and in an embodied manner. So I try to move away from this picture to the right, which is what we traditionally think that science is all about, like transcending with our minds the world and removing ourselves from it as if we did not belong to it. And then we look at animals as these alien creatures, and we think, well, we cannot possibly assume that they are thinking this or that, or that they want this or that, because, I mean, we would be anthropomorphizing them. So yeah, if we turn to the left, to that other image, we realize that anthropomorphizing, when done critically, is not to be as feared as it usually is. The central argument in this first chapter, very condensed here, of course, because of time, is that animals, humans, and beyond are intentional subjects who perceive cues in the environment through their bodily senses, give them meaning, and then move with agency, which means that their behavior is surprising rather than mechanical. And then they communicate that meaning in an embodied manner. So this is how I describe animals, and phenomenology is traditionally a descriptive field. So I had to construct a normative argument from that. And that's when I resorted not only to Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, but also to care ethics. By arguing that both care ethics and phenomenology can actually contribute to one another, I was able to conclude basically that because animals make their preferences and interests public through intentional embodied communication, for instance, through empathy, which with phenomenology we understand as this feeling with in an embodied manner and this sharing of an experience rather than a feeling for, um, we have a duty to listen to them and then to respond to them. In chapter 2, I then proceeded to actually put that into practice. And rather than focusing on narratives of suffering, which I also did, especially when I talked about grief, but also trauma when I discussed zoos and aquariums and so on, I try to find other narratives or alternative narratives of encountering animals that were not necessarily bad, because I did not want to position myself as a welfarist or abolitionist or argue that we should end every kind of interaction with animals or that it's always necessarily bad. Because what I'm trying to do is quite the opposite. I'm trying to embrace my own animality and suggest that we all do that and that we understand that we too are part of nature and that just as we also are agents in nature, animals are agents too. So they are not these objects in the landscape, right, who are just playing a role. And so I divided focusing on vulnerability as this more material idea of us all being subjected to dying, right? Also a relational aspect of vulnerability and a contextual one, which is very important, and it's about power. And then I divided this in collaboration, trauma, love, and care. And I worked with a lot of different sources of narratives, right? So ecological reports, which are very important when it comes to thinking about animals and how to respond to animals in the best way possible, but also narratives from my personal experience or from literature, fictional literature. And I think my favorite story here is the one with the Guarani and the bees. So this story came up the first time I was walking with my childhood friend, Laura Papalardo, who is an architect and studying now sociology. And she does this amazing work with the Guarani at the Jaraguá Peak, close to São Paulo. And we were discussing the very complex and controversial relationship between human and animals in this context of indigenous cultures. And then she told me how they perceived bees as individuals, and we started talking more. We even worked on a paper together, which we presented. And she sent me this documentary, and this elder in the community there, the Guarani, he says, well, who cares for the bees is always one person. Because of their system, the bee system, of recognizing through smell and getting used to that person, it has to be always the same person. That's how the bee likes to be taken care of, and that's how we make sure that the bee doesn't leave the box. And also, the same person needs to be the one who takes your honey. It needs to be just the necessary amount that they use for religious practices and for medicine for children mainly to take away the bitterness of the medicine. And it's only a little so not to disturb the bees. And they never let it go to waste. And it's a very nice relationship because when you see the handler dealing with the bees, you can see how he's respecting their agency and how they are collaborating, providing honey and also pollinating the Atlantic forest, which is, of course, good for both of them. And they are caring for the bees. And yes, these are stingless native bees to Brazil that they are doing this very important work with. So I just wanted to find alternatives and other stories and ways to include different people in the conversation, animals and beyond human animals in a multi-species and multicultural way. But how does this conversation take place? So imagine here this cat called Emilia. Emilia wants to eat. So because she wants to eat, she moves in a certain manner, she does certain things that because of intentionality or the fact that her consciousness is always connected to the outside world in a way. There's no such thing as the outside world, but just to make this more visual, we are able to access what Emilia is going through, at least partially. Because consciousness in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is not secluded in the mind, but rather it's in the body. So you exist in the world through your body. The body is a vehicle for consciousness. So from that, Ana Paula can think, well, Emilia wants food. And then she can properly respond to Emilia by giving her food. And this is possible, of course, because not only are they bodies, but they share the same flesh of the world, the same earthly world. They are hovering over the same thing, which is food, which carries different meanings for Emilia and for Ana Paula, but it's there in the world. And this is done by accepting that we are, when we're doing this, dealing with a subject who has already made their own interpretations of the situation and then decided to act with agency. And then we listen to that, and then we interpret that, and then we also decide how to act and engage in a form of communication. Another example of this is my dogs. They had to be here, Jorge and Tete. They are in São Paulo right now. But Jorge to the left is the troublemaker. And he's a very traumatized dog who was rescued from this favela in Sao Paulo. He lived there for about a year before he came to our home as a stray dog. And it's been very hard to learn how to communicate with him, but we're improving, I say, ups and downs. But this situation, I think, explains a bit what I'm trying to say. So we have this neighbor that we really dislike because we had this neighbor. We had to move because of him, actually. But imagine the situation. We had 4 apartments per floor, right? So whenever the elevator door opened, I could hear the elevator door and I would think, well, someone is outside, but I didn't know who because of the door preventing me from seeing outside. But Jorge, because he has this very good sense of smell and of hearing, he could infer, right, through first interpreting the cues in the environment, which he perceived through his sensuous, so his sense of smell, his sense of hearing. He knew that that was the guy who was outside, which for him meant somebody he disliked, he was scared of. And so he would communicate with that guy and with me. So this guy is in the world, an actual thing in the world, to which Jorge gives a certain meaning. And then he barks to the guy, very scared, trying to, I know you're there, please don't come any closer. And to me, making me aware of what's going on and perhaps asking me to intervene in a way and to be aware, right, if I need to do something about it. And then when this happens, I'm able to, by looking at Jorge, understand who is outside, even if I can see them. And that's how I can, of course, learn what he's going through and then properly respond. So this is basically what I was trying to show. In the 3rd chapter, I first discuss the animal in animal rights, right? So what animals are to become legal persons. Then I turn to the 2 kinds of interests that we have within the interest theory of rights. So we have welfare interests, which are related to what's, of course, good for someone or what we need in order to flourish. So here I described some welfare fundamental interests animals have, and that should be responded to by the law based on their vulnerabilities, individual, relational, and contextual. And of course, I'm able to do that by applying the procedure I try to exemplify and to illustrate in the 2nd chapter. And then what I do next is talk about the preference interests, which are those interests that come from agency. So animals want things. They prefer to do one thing instead of another. And just like with humans, it's always complicated to see what to do when someone wants to do something that's not good for them. So how much are they aware of what's going on, that they can be allowed to make those choices? So this is kind of the debate I try to present and engage with in this 3rd topic, this 3rd section. And then in the final one, I try to show ways that we already have kind of, in courts of law at least, allowed animals to participate in the conversation. And of course, we need to do much more than that. And then we move from this realistic approach to an ideal one of what would the world look like if we move towards this post-anthropocentric framework, and how could, in this scenario, we think about animals, for instance, laboring? Would that be okay or not? Under what circumstances? How do we think about their health decisions, right? If they are agents, like how do we balance all of that? And then in the appendix, what I did was I try to find common ground between environmental rights, nature rights, and animal rights. Because, like I said in the beginning, in the Anthropocene, they're very much related to one another. And I think it's something we have to do rather than fighting for different agendas. I try to do that also with human rights, following Saskia Stuki. And yeah, so this is what I try to do, and then focus on compassionate education and conservation practices that are compassionate and focused on the subject, not only on the environment, and how that can benefit both these agendas as well as the animals as subjects. And just to talk a little bit more about this final part about animals and in courts of law. So this comes from the idea that animals are agents, like I said, and I bring a lot of narratives of animals protesting or fighting back, and it's not without controversy if that's what's going on. But I do want to discuss briefly two cases that I think that illustrate that we already have a little bit of what I'm suggesting happening in the field of law. So in Brazil, we have been having more and more cases of dogs, for now it's just dogs, acting as legal plaintiffs in lawsuits, and judges accepting their presence there. But in this particular case, which was very interesting earlier this year, Toquinho had been a victim of mistreatment. So the person who had taken care of him was to receive, according to the ruling, money for the expenses she had taking care of Toquinho. Perfect. Now, the judge also decided that Toquinho had been harmed himself in what he refers to as his personality rights related to his honor, for instance. And because of that, he was to receive moral damages in the amount of 5,000 reais, which is usually the amount we, at least when I used to practice law back in the day, many years ago, it used to be what you give to a human when they suffer regular moral damages. So that's very interesting. And this other case, Fee versus Doe from the UK, we had two people who used to be a couple and they wanted to get a divorce. So in the process, in the proceeding, both of them, as it's very common, wanted to keep the dog to themselves. So the husband argued that the dog had been bought by him. He had purchased the dog, and also that he had chronic depression. So he really just had registered the dog as this emotional support animal. And he had very traditionally strong arguments. And then the wife came and said, well, but I have been taking care of the dog for 12 months, which in the dog's perspective is a long time. And further, the husband at one point tried to snatch the dog from the grandma who was walking the dog. And what the dog did was they were able to run away and run back to the wife and children's house. So in the ruling, and that's where I conclude my brief presentation, the judge really gave a lot of importance to the fact that the dog wanted to be with the family, right, with the wife and the kids, because of how this embodied communication took place. And that's very simple, very easy to assess. And he took into consideration the other interests that were involved, but ultimately he decided to listen to what the dog had to say. So yeah, that's what I had to present today. I look forward to your comments, objections, and questions, of course. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ana. Professor Monticelli, you may begin with your examination, please.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go. I want to, let me change this. Okay. I want to thank you for the invitation, because it served me the great opportunity to read this dissertation, and it aligns well with the work I have been doing. And we even edited a book that will be published soon, discussing animals' rights as persons. There is a chapter in this book by a lawyer, a male lawyer, a fabulous woman, who has been winning coaching cases, arguing that dogs have the right to use the social elevator. She even defended a dog against its guardian, maybe just like the dog you have just shown to us. And I have also been studying human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. And so it was great to read this. The text, the dissertation, is incredibly well written and organized. You really you are really defending a thesis in this written document. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Well, I knew very little about Merleau-Ponty. I used it to give classes together with a philosopher that loved Merleau-Ponty. I think that was his specialty. So I heard something about him, about Merleau-Ponty, from this colleague, and he had already showed me some similarities with ethology or some topics that I should read, because this philosophy would help me to understand other things. So you put this in practice when you invited me to read this and to be here to discuss with you. So I have some comments to discuss with you that I have here in my PDF. Just a moment. Okay, I think it's here. Well, just a little moment to be in the page. Okay. You still see me, not? Let me see. Okay. You still hearing me and see me? Yeah. Okay. The question of the anthropocentrism. I don't know if you know the primatologist Franz de Waal. Yeah. What is your formation? The academic. You are a biologist. You are a philosophy.
Do you want me to answer it now? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
my background is law, but that's when I decided. Well, during my master's, I already just really worked with philosophy and with bioethics, because I was working with dying with dignity and so on. And that's the reason why I went to Rio in the first place to do my PhD, because Professor Ana Paula is both a phenomenologist and a legal scholar. So I wanted, and she works with arts, and I've always been very interdisciplinary. So I wanted that. So that's why I dug deep into all these fields that are not my fields of origin.
it was incredible to put you two together, and you have the co-survivor. I'm not sure about the English term for this, and let me take it again. Okay, so I was talking about the primatologist Franz de Waal, and he studied for a long time chimpanzees, and when you look, when you as an ethologist, or when you look for many years to chimps interacting, it's impossible to deny the very similarities and the social cognitive abilities of them. So you talked about grief, luto, né? Grief. Yeah, okay. And he also defends this with other animals. So in the last books of him, he has just he's dead now. But in the last two books of him, one is called Mama's Last Hug. And Mama, you know, Mama was a senior chimp, and it's incredible, this book. And the other one is Are We Smart Enough to Know What the Animals Think, or something like that. So reading your text, I went back to him many times. And okay, so one thing that he says is that the denying, the avoiding the anthropomorphism has it. You said this ahead in your text also, that we lost much time denying the anthropomorphism, and we had the opposite effect with that. So we denied for a long time the cognitive and social and emotional abilities of the others. Then it's in your text. So I will jump to the chapter 2, because I think I'm here especially because of that. But I first want to emphasize that your text, all your text is beautiful, is convincing, is well presented. I think it's been some time that I don't have a dissertation that is so spectacular. that is really a thesis being defending, you argue, you present many data, and you put this all together along the chapter. So it's incredible, I really think. And you may know that the ethologists in the beginning, Konrad Lorenz, Carl von Frisch, and Tinbergen, that they had many troubles, they were challenged about the behaviorism, because the behaviorism would say that we cannot go inside the black box, the mind of other animals. And then we had to look to behavior with much objectivity, no trying to be no subjective, and it's exactly opposed, I think, of the Merleau-Ponty view. So I was thinking, for me, it would be the correct word, where we had to go. We must now to change our way of seeing the other animals, and I do that in my classes. I am a biologist, ethologist, and my classes are from to students learning psychology. So they want to learn human mind. And seeing that as a totally apart thing from the other animals and so on. So in my course, I really go through that animals, we are animals, and we can see, I show many examples of things that the other animals do. But we have also we are still being asked to be objective in what we say and so on. So thinking about that, I would ask you to discuss with me a little bit about when we say we can see emotions in animal behavior when we look at it, when we experience living with them. So, for example, the dogs, the cats, the primates. Okay, we really can interpret them, and I think it's no. We cannot deny the expression of emotions are very similar, no? So it's okay. But when you go to fishes or insects, it's much more difficult for us mammals to interpret what they are seeing. And if we are supposed to give all animals their rights or the personhood, I think you use this term. How can we do with insects and fishes? So I would like to hear you a little bit about that.
Okay, so first of all, I almost cried here when you were making your comments, so thank you very much for that. It's been a very personal enterprise, and yeah, I really appreciate your comments. And yeah, also, Franceval, I got in touch with him many years ago because my grandma, who's been vegetarian for 60 years, she's always loved him. And I did not use more of his work because I was trying to move away from this ape experience, right? For the reasons that I think are clear. But yeah, definitely. So I'm glad that that was possible. And I guess when it comes to insects and fishes, it's so complicated. So what I try to argue at the end is that even though I think that all animals should become legal persons, right? I do think we can have different catalogs of rights for different, not kinds of animals, right? But rather different relationships we establish with them. This is, of course, something I borrowed from Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson in Zoopolis. And I think it's interesting because it brings to the debate about what is moral and what is not. Also, our responsibility towards someone, right? So that's the example I gave, for instance. That's something we discussed actually in this conference in Birmingham. Like, okay, so I do think fleas have rights. So I have a dog, and the dog was full with fleas. Like, what do I do? And then how I solved that afterwards when I was provoked actually by my supervisor Thomas Buchmann, and then I try to solve that by considering that we do have a different responsibility with dogs, be it because of our shared history with them, which also makes it easier for us to learn their interests and respond to them, of course, be it because George and Teter in my house, if there is a fire and I need to save the neighbor Off the dogs. I'll save the dogs every time. And my husband too. He's going to die in the fire. I told him that, and I told him to save me too. We saved the dogs. So I try to take that approach, but it's super complicated. So perhaps for these animals, also they are the animals we are not in touch with. I'm not proposing we engage with all animals and create one great community. But when we do have to engage with them, for instance, through conservation practices, we decide to move this population from here to here. So, okay, these animals are directly being affected. So let's discuss with them. Eva Meyer, she has some examples of this kind of political debate you can have with animals. For instance, by giving them incentives to go to a certain way rather than another, and nonviolent practices. But it's super challenging, and I guess it's supposed to be just, I take for granted that ours is an anthropocentric society. It's not going to change. We can get to a maybe post-anthropocentric situation, but never, I guess, to a non-anthropocentric landscape. And we are humans making rights based on our morals. Different animals have their own morals and their own rules and their own right. So I like that Jane Goodall, when she goes and live with apes, she learns their ways of being and being with. And so it's the opposite that will happen. So it's always going to be challenging. But overall, there are some general interests that we can learn. And I'll give you an example that happened to me 2 days before this defense here. I was sleeping here in Münster, where I don't have a lot of contact with insects like I do in Brazil. And then I felt something on my neck when I woke up. And then I removed it with my fingers, and it was a huge wasp that stung my finger. And then the wasp fell into the floor, and it hurt so much, it's still hurting. And then I turned on the light, and then I saw the wasp, and I was like, oh God. The wasp was scared of me, was defending themselves from me. What I did was I took the wasp in a bowl, and I put her outside. She ran, or they ran, they flew away. That's what I do with mosquitoes here too. And I think it's in these interactions, I can see that they are trying to protect themselves and move away from me. Or the fleas that come and eat my food, right? I once did not remove the food from my table until the flea had stopped eating it. So I don't think that there's an answer, but rather this posture for us to start this dialogues and just like Donna Hathaway says, and I try to give that idea, just stay with the trouble, even when it's so hard. Just try to open our minds to that. That's what I try to do. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes, I was not thinking about the flea and the mosquito. I was thinking about outside the human home. I was not thinking about the flea.
But those animals, as long as we are not in contact with them, it's okay. I mean, we can think about general interests that they have. But if we do have to have contact with them, then I think we need to be paying attention to that. Because also, I didn't talk about this, but there are some scholars who are arguing that animals may have a right to privacy, right? So maybe they don't want to be here. Maybe they don't want to be. Recently, I started paying attention to that. So even when I'm walking, I was recently in Scotland. I was walking and I saw a cow and then goats, and then you went to look and take pictures, and they seemed very apprehensive. And I was like, okay, so they don't want me to take pictures. And just when this encounter happens, maybe that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's a natural interaction between two species, two individuals, and okay, I think that the problem we have to solve is to seeing all the world, all the lands as a human habitation, and then there is no space for the other. So here now, I am fighting against the how can I say that? About the urbanization here in Ribeirão Preto, the agriculture is being changed. Some lands are being occupied by immobiliary, by houses. Okay, and we have here the burrow owl, a coruja buraqueira. Burrow owl, and I saw some nests. They do the nest underground, and I saw a nest be destroyed. It was destroyed by a tractor, and then I called the policeman, and the person was had a price to pay, and okay, but I also I'm also working with it in research and in what we call here extension. So we will take students to go to those areas and to put placas, how can I say, to install
Plates, signs, maybe signs.
Yeah. So there is oral nest, and you cannot do anything until the infants have gone away. So it's I think there is the problem. There is an example of when men and fauna going in conflict, and they always lose. We always win. We are not winning, but so you say the climatic changes and the social and public health aspects of this and that. So yeah, I will finish soon. I just like to go again to see the example of the George, the dog, and the neighbor. Another way to see that would be that we say, and I really think the dog and you were communicating, and that there is intentionality and conscious, and okay. But someone would say, that I will not talk about that you could just learn that this sign, the dog signaling, the dog behavior, you would have learned by association that this behavior means the neighbor is coming, and maybe the dog is would not be communicating anything. Now, someone would say it's just it could be independent learning process. So you interpret the behavior of the dog, and it's not that the dog is saying the neighbor is coming and you interpret this, something like that. And you also could learn signs that the neighbor is coming by your own, independently of the dog. So you hear the moving feet, and even if you are not aware that you are hearing, you hear. So you perceive, but you are not conscious about your perception. And then you say, okay, the neighbor is coming. How would you answer this?
Okay, so well, I think that this example with the neighbor, of course, I created this scenario where there is a door and I cannot see the neighbor outside. And when I just hear the elevator door, right, I can only hear that noise. But it's still like in that moment, because Jorge starts barking, like when we arrive home, he can smell us from like, he's terrible with his barking. So that's what I mean. Like even in a situation, it could be a number of situations where that is not part of my Umwelt because I cannot access it through my senses. It becomes part of my Umwelt once Jorge communicates that to me. And the answer to how can I demonstrate that? That's what I try to show, I think, with this phenomenological posture of understanding that my body, right, reciprocates George's body. So this idea of reciprocity that Merleau-Ponty talks about, and of the fact that we are in the same sharing the flesh of the world, which means not just that, like in the interworld where we engage with one another intersubjectively, but also when we create meaning together because we are referring to something that's in the world. Like the neighbor is actually there. And of course, this is something you need in this case is context. I know the story behind that. We could have different situations, but what I was trying to show is that it is possible, right, to do that, and then we need to think about how. And just briefly returning to the first question, I thought of something that I forgot to say is when you're thinking about rights, like some generalizations have to be made. Like we have to, right, have some general interest that we protect, for instance, the right to life or to health or etc. And then when we apply it, we will of course ponder it with other rights and then look at context, etc. And in case of these animals we are not in touch with, they can have these general interests, right? That we learn by looking at them. That's what I also try to do in chapter 2. And then when I talked about animals' interests, find this very general interest based on their experiences. And Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson would say that they are not citizens of our human communities, right? They are just their own sovereign states. They're with their own rules. And anyway, so I guess that's what I wanted to complement that question with.
Okay, I'm sorry for this English, this picotated English. I asked the other professors to
It's all right. It's perfect. It was all right. Thank you very much. And do you have another questions to Anna, or may add something further?
Yeah, just I want to say that I was there in Minster also many time ago, and it's a lovely city. And I would like to ask you how and why you choose me to be here in this evaluation.
Well, as you yourself mentioned it, you are an ethologist, and I actually try to engage with ethology very actively. I have actually spoken in the annual encounter of ethologists at USP 2 years ago, maybe, or last year. And I'll be speaking this year too in Espírito Santo. And I really wanted that. And of course, you have invited, I guess, Ana Paula to write a preface for your own work. And then she noticed that you had like this approach that was not strictly, like ecological practice and so on. You have all of this background. And that's why I felt like it was, can you hear me? Yes, that's why I felt it was important, because a great part of this work, okay, a great part of this work is ecological. So I could just be, saying whatever. So I wanted to have someone to validate that too.
Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Can move on now to Professor Shekaira. Okay, you have the word. Thank you, Fabio, for being here today.
Thanks, Anna. This is a pleasure. Anna Caramuru now. I learned a lot by reading your thesis. This isn't my area, so I learned much more than I could teach you about the subject. This is one reason for my being brief too. I don't have very much to add to your interesting arguments. I wrote many notes while I was reading your thesis, but later realized that many of them were just quibbles that don't really deserve being emphasized in a forum like this. So I tried to narrow down my comments to maybe 3 or 4 points that I think are not quibbles. I think they're not. They seem a little more significant and substantive. and most of them have to do with chapter one. I found chapters 2 and 3 more persuasive than chapter one, even though they're all connected. So let me focus on chapter one. Uh, well, I should preface my comments by saying that your work, as Patricia, my colleague, just said, is very well written. I like how you're much more of a fox than a hedgehog, to use, the old dictum. And by that I mean that you're ready to derive insights from many different authors working in many different traditions. You vary in terms of style too, sometimes a bit more academic, sometimes more conversational, which keeps it light and interesting. You're very generous to beginners like myself because you're constantly defining and illustrating the more technical concepts and then summarizing the chapters. That's very helpful. After chapter one, I learned that it was a good idea to begin with a summary, go to the beginning of the chapter, and then read the summary again. That was helpful. Um, so yeah, a very good general impression that you left. But let me get to the sort of my substantive concerns with chapter one. So it's essential to your project to avoid anthropocentrism, right? You don't want to be anthropocentric. But I don't think you have one definition of anthropocentrism that you apply consistently throughout the chapter. I think I found 3 definitions in the chapter, and they're all subtly different. I'm not sure which one I should keep. Perhaps you might counter by saying, no, they're all interconnected. Definitions 2 and 3 are implied by definition 1, but I don't quite see that. So let me tell you what those 3 definitions are by my lights, and then you tell me if I'm mistaken. On page 24, I think you give the most explicit definition. You cite Calarco by saying that let me quote you. To clarify what I mean by anthropocentrism, and then you define Calarco, it refers to a set of ideas, structures, and practices aimed at establishing and reproducing the privileged status of those who are deemed to be fully and quintessentially human. I found that a very interesting definition. It's intuitive. It's what I might say anthropocentrism is if I try to define it. It has something to do with a hierarchical picture of the world, according to which, we are on top and non-human animals are at the bottom. But then as you move along the chapter, I think you give more demanding definitions. Definitions according to which it's harder to avoid being anthropocentric than the first one. So around pages 46 to 48, I think you give implicitly, I don't think you stop to define it as you do at 24, but you give the implicit definition that to avoid anthropocentrism, we have to realize that humans and other animals inhabit different worlds, right? So it's about realizing this. You're anthropocentric if you think that there's one world, our world, into which animals fit or try to fit. That sounds more demanding than just acknowledging that there isn't a hierarchy, right? It requires, deeper philosophizing than just rejecting the claim, the precept that we are superior beings or that we have special moral standing or something like that. So I don't think definition 2 follows from 1. I think it adds to 1, and I think it's more demanding of us. And then later on at page 55, I think you give a 3rd definition. And I think it's even more demanding, the definition number 2. So there's one particular passage that I found striking. Let me quote. This is you writing. You say, we must also suspend concepts and prejudices we mistakenly take for granted and adopt a new posture when engaging in the beyond human world. So here, I think you're saying that to avoid being anthropocentric, not only do we have to realize that we and other animals inhabit different worlds, we also have to be ready to suspend our concepts and prejudices, or at least some of them, right? There is an issue here about how clear this is. I'm not entirely sure I understand what's going on here. that may not be a problem for you. You're dealing with an approach, the phenomenological approach, which is admittedly and maybe proudly fuzzy at the edges, and that's not a problem itself. But I do have some questions. Suspending concepts uh, may seem like an impossible task. What do we have but our concepts, right? Uh, Suspending prejudices may seem more feasible. I'm not sure these are the same thing. How can I suspend my concepts? I'm not sure. I think I can suspend prejudices because prejudices sound like they're not concepts, but they're full propositions, right? I think so. I think I can state a prejudice in propositional form. I can say I'm prejudiced insofar as I think that uh, you know chimps are deserving of more respect than bees. That's a prejudice. I don't think I can avoid the concepts that go into that proposition ever. I don't think I can ever throw them away or even suspend them. But I do think I can question the prejudice, the fully formed proposition by just rearranging the concepts or introducing other concepts and so on. So I do have this worry about this claim that we can suspend our concepts. Maybe we can suspend our prejudices. Not sure we can suspend our concepts. But even if that's not a problem, I'm not sure, and this is my main worry, that this definition that I'm calling definition 3 really follows or is implied by definition 2. I think it adds something new too, because even if we realize that we inhabit different worlds, right? Even if I know that Georges' world is not mine, that he perceives differently, he sees differently, hears differently, smells differently, and so on, and expresses himself differently, and all that. Uh, Realizing that, I think, doesn't amount to suspending any number of concepts and prejudices. So I get the impression that as you move along the chapter, you're demanding more and more, but you don't really stop to tell us how much you're demanding at the end and what your final definition of anthropocentrism is. So you sort of give hints to the reader, but you don't, and you're so careful all the time to let us know what you're up to that I think this chapter was uncharacteristic in that sense, right? Maybe you could hold our hands a bit more when you're telling us what anthropocentrism is and how demanding it actually is. I think definition 1 is very easy to satisfy. Definition 2 is a little more difficult. Definition 3 is very difficult, and I don't think they're all the same. So, but maybe I'm missing something. That's my main point about chapter 1. Let me add one less important point, but which is hard to avoid because I'm a legal philosopher that spent a lot of time thinking about positivism and its rivals. There's one point at page 76 where you bring up, the um, uh, well-known accusation that positivism, in some sense, contributed to or facilitated the implementation of fascism in Europe and so on. I think a lot of ink has been spilt on this subject, but I think most of the ink, at least when it's spilled by sophisticated writers, has been spilled to say that this is a caricature, that the story is much more complicated, and there's very little evidence that positivism is to blame as one of the factors that facilitated the rise of fascism in Europe and so on. So I'd avoid that kind of claim until you've sort of carefully reviewed the literature that presents the counter argument. I'm not sure. Maybe you have presented it, but it doesn't appear in your references, so I wasn't sure. Uh, but I mean, this you could erase those sentences with no detriment to your argument, right? I mean, it's not really important to your work. That's why it's a quibble more than a substantive point. One thing I was curious about while reading the thesis as a whole, not just chapter 1, is that your bibliography is so vast and sophisticated that it would be unfair to just say, oh, but you missed this author or that author. But I was just curious about the fact that since you're such a fox and you're willing to, derive insights from all these different traditions, that I didn't see any reference to Mary Midgley, who was one of the few, authors writing about animal interests that I know about, that I read during my graduate studies. And she favors this relational and context-sensitive approach that I thought you might find congenial. But maybe you know her work and you have a very good reason to avoid her. In that case, I'm just making a sort of a silly remark. But in case you just never read her, or maybe you might be interested in looking at her work and finding her as an additional, helpful source of insights. Um, one quibble. I'm not going to mention any of the quibbles about chapter 3 because they're really silly, and I think chapter 3 is very good. About chapter 2, one thing that I noticed that is that your beautiful summaries at the end of each chapter. The summary at the end of chapter 2, I think, was a little bit less helpful than the other summaries, just because you tell us these interesting and tragic and moving stories in the course of the chapter, and then at the end, when you give the summary, you just sort of briefly tell us the stories again. You don't take the opportunity to tell us how the stories contribute to the things you're saying in chapter 1 and chapter 3. So maybe you could, hold our hands even more and let us know how those stories fit into the picture. I mean, I have guesses about how they fit. Not guesses. I mean, I have a good idea of how they fit, but you could be explicit about this at the end of the chapter summary. Let me see if I missed anything. No, yeah, I think the only thing that's really important is my concern about what it is to be anthropocentric, considering those three definitions, if they are three distinct definitions. Let me insist that I learned very much about reading your thesis, and I have all these authors and books written down that I have to find time to read because they're very interesting, and you've raised my awareness about them. And this was so easy and pleasant to read. As Patricia said, if only all our PhD theses were written in such accessible language and filled with interesting stories and so on, our lives would be much easier than they are. So this was great, Anna. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you so much for those words, Professor Fabio Shikada. Well, of course, you are very needed in this panel because legal theory is also a very important, I guess, part of the work. Even though I try to make it less, you know, uh, accessible, like you said. Try to that's a concern that I had. And it was actually your comment in the qualification panel that drove me to really explain those ideas in animal rights. And sometimes we take for granted that everybody's familiar with them. And we forget that that's not the case, myself included, like maybe 7, 8 years ago, I was not. So we forget that that's the case. So that was very important because I really want to publish it as a book. It's a requirement here um, for Germany. And I would ask you if you can to share all those notes with me because I will, of course, work on this manuscript before sending it to publication. And I love the comments you made. They are spot on. So the first one regarding anthropomorphism, you're right. I need to be more clear about what I mean when I say anthropomorphism. In fact, when you started saying that, I was like, but I think I was very clear when I cited Calarco. I think, and then you pointed out that I used it, and I didn't even realize it. But I guess for me, the way they are connected, and I will make that more explicit, is that at first when I was constructing that argument of intersectionality and power and anthropocentrism as being this larger umbrella where different ideologies fit and engage with one another, I still didn't have the resources to talk about worlds in terms of Umwelten and other phenomenological concepts because I was just presenting first arguments first to not be scared of, I guess, trying to argue that we should be doing that, right? Rethinking how we treat animals. But then later on, when I say that anthropocentrism is also about seeing that there are many worlds out there, this was actually derived from school and the Umwelt theory, because the first time I read his account of the Umwelt, I was so like, it was mind blowing. And to think that the sea for me is not the sea as it is for a jellyfish, and how much that matters in terms of differences in how we perceive time. And yeah, so that was mind blowing. So I guess what I was trying to say is that when we when we engage with this anthropocentric ideology, we miss the chance to see and appreciate difference. And we do that with humans, right? There are many different ways of being in the world. And if we just use our own experiences as the, well, this is the standard, and you fall short of that, that's not at all what we should be doing. So I wanted to emphasize, and I think I need to make that more clear, how this adds up to that other idea, perhaps. And the third one, when I talked about suspending concepts, you're very on point again about the maybe the word that I used. And at another point of the dissertation, I explained it a little bit better when I talk about Husserl, because he understands phenomenology as being this kind of an invitation to bracket for a moment concepts that we have been accustomed to understand like this or that. For instance, autonomy, right? We have this understanding in our context of what autonomy is, or sentience, right? So I try to debate sentience in the end. So what I was trying to do is bracket some concepts, and then so not suspend them and like and ignore them, but it's just trying to just okay. I'm really sure that this is that, but maybe it's not. So maybe let's look at this through other lenses, and the idea is to change the posture to that one that I try to show the image of being in the world of, and how that might change how we understand this concept. So when I said suspend, I was referring to this bracketing by Husserl. So I think I need to make that more clear as well. You're completely right. The way it's written can be, I guess, leave room for doubt. And then what you said about positivism, yeah, perfect. I actually just sometimes we do that. We're reading literature on the history of something, and we try to summarize that a bit because it's not exactly the focus of the work. And yes, you're right. I'm a positivist myself. I don't think that positivism is is necessarily related to that at all. I just wanted to give some background as to what might have happened, and according to secondary literature. So maybe, or for sure, I need to at least present a debate in a footnote, and for a more detailed debate, see this, that. I think you're right. I don't want to give that impression of, yeah, that I agree with that, or that I am not myself positive. And finally, the summary. Yeah, totally. Chapter 2 was so hard for me because I wrote it, and then I separated into topics, and then it was very all the writing was very, it moved a lot, and I guess it was hard because it was law paper monograph dealing with different fields and with arts, and trying to speak from this personal creative space. And then chapter 2 was the chapter where I felt more free to do that. So it was hard for me to summarize that in a similar fashion as I had done with first and third chapters. But I guess it makes complete sense. I try to do what I did in the other ones, like just highlight the conclusions. But perhaps for chapter 2, the conclusions are not exactly a summary of the stories, but rather, yeah, how they can relate, how they integrate that bigger picture, and the conclusions I can take from them. So you are right. And that's a good idea also to bring the summary in the beginning. I recently read Eva Mayer's book, and she does that below the subtitle, right, or the chapter title, a small paragraph with the summary. I could do that. That's a possibility before publishing it. So thanks for that comment as well. And I hope I was able to answer, and yeah, and I really appreciate also your words.
Are you satisfied with the answers, Fabio?
I am, Anna. Thank you.
Okay, so we can move on to Professor Jochen Ach. You may begin your questioning, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me say that I'm also quite impressed by the broad scope of your work and a dissertation that is really good written and very good readable. But in my opinion, this might have a price you are paying in that some of the concepts you are applying in your work are a little bit vague in my view. So at least I would like to hear much more on concepts like animal agency or embodied autonomy. And I would like to hear much more about how they relate to, say, the discussions on autonomy in the more liberal tradition. So perhaps it is a good idea that, for me at least, that I have an expert at hand who can tell me a bit more about animal agency, a concept that is made use of in animal ethics widely nowadays. But for me at least, it still is somehow mysterious. This would be my, not question, but what I would ask you to do for me. What I'm not convinced of is your argument that more conventional interest-based ethics are prone to be too pain-centered. This is one of your critiques. And in my view, of course, avoiding pain is one interest we all have, and a central one maybe, but it is only one interest we have, and we do have a lot of other interests as well. So maybe that scholars like Bentham stick to the very idea of avoiding pain, but for example, Peter Singer and others as a preference, utilitarians do have a much wider concept of interest. And this brings me to my second question. This is, would you think that your phenomenological approach, as you advocated, is important with regard to the justification of norms in animal ethics? Or does it essentially serve a heuristic function by making it possible to better identify and understand the interests of animals? I'm not quite clear what your position is there. And in the same context, perhaps, you talk about trees and plants, and I do not really know what your answer is in the end, because obviously trees and plants are, well, living bodies somehow, and I'm not clear what your arguments might be to avoid ascribing moral status to trees and plants if you stick to the Merleau-Ponty discussion and so on. And my final problem is that you are telling us a lot of examples of what animals are doing, thinking, wanting, and so on and so on. And in my view, some of these examples come very close to a problematic form of anthropomorphism. In my understanding, this stems from your idea that when we try to figure out what interests animals have, we do something like interpreting interpretations. And my question would be, is there some possibility to control these interpretations in order to avoid anthropomorphism, and might this be?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for those very interesting points, and also our conversation that we had early this year that really helped me to give a different direction to this final part, because at first I wanted, I don't know if you remember, to move away from sentience altogether and to use phenomenology as something else. So after that, I realized that, and maybe I need to be more clear about that. I don't mean to say that the most traditional approaches are there, or that all of them are very much concerned with pain in this very simplistic reductionist manner. But I do mean to say that, and that's something I just hear a lot and see a lot, that when we are thinking about or debating or to what animals we should be thinking about in animal ethics, the test of whether they can or cannot feel pain is often used as the only important thing to argue for sentience. And what I wanted to show, not that the interests that come after that they are always related to pain, but rather that maybe we don't have to be doing all of these tests and harming animals, right? Because we put fishes in bowls and then we see, oh, they're not reacting to the anesthesia, or they are. So it's awful. So that we can argue in the end, oh, yes, they do feel pain. But then we torture them for that. So I was trying to do something else. And I think that needs to be more clear. You are right, completely right. I will make that adjustment, because that's not at all what I meant to say. And actually, I wanted to go to that idea that we discussed, sentience as being someone for whom things are like and having this subjective understanding of the world. And this leads me to the second question about phenomenology. So what I try to do in this dissertation is actually turn to both of those questions that you presented. So first of all, yes, the justification for rights, because like I said, legal personhood does not need to be related to the descriptive notion of personhood, but we do need criteria to determine that. And in short, the criteria is sentience. But what I try to do is bracket sentience, like I was talking about a bit earlier, and think actually, what is sentience, right? And I think phenomenology can help us with that, with giving a better account of sentience. And authors like Marta Nussbaum, for instance, in her recent book, she gives a very phenomenological depiction of sentience. Kristen Korsgaard also, Anna Paula and I have published a paper on how a lot of phenomenological ideas are present in her work, even if it's not intentional. And so what I was trying to do is bracket sentience and then describe it in more detail. So in that sense, yes, offering responses to why we should be caring for animals. And I try to also do that directly from Merleau-Ponty's writings when he says things like, the will to speak is one and the same as the will to be understood. So there is an interest there when you speak, when I'm here talking, an interest in being understood. So he describes the birth of this interest of being heard. And then with the aid of care ethics, and I forgot to respond to Fabio Shekhaida's comment about that bibliography that I have not read. There are so many ecofeminists and care ethicists, and I'm so thankful for that suggestion. I'm going to read it for sure. But I was able then to argue that when we communicate with animals in the form of empathy as described by phenomenology, according to care ethicists, this comes with a duty to act. So it's not just the feeling with someone else, but rather doing something about it. So you have to listen and then you have to respond. And then coming back to phenomenology, and this is the second question you posed here, phenomenology assists us with a toolkit for listening, for caring, describing these practices as embodied. Really, I think phenomenology, and perhaps this is the most important aspect of it, but I think they both work in terms of describing and learning the content, which is very challenging and limited, but at least doing a better job in asking animals to participate in the conversation, which is why I think the concepts that I bring are not based necessarily on what's being discussed in analytical philosophy or bioethics about what is autonomy. That's something I actually did more in my master's because it was a more liberal, I guess, approach to the autonomy to die. But here, I wanted to take that approach that's very much developed, I guess, by Eva Meyer, to learn from and with animals what she does that in her work with language. She brackets language and says, well, I don't want to go to the traditional views of language. I want to ask animals what language are and look at their experiences and learn from them what that is. So that's what I was trying to do, and that's why I tried to connect the second chapter with the third. And that's what I called embodied autonomy, which Professor Gutmann noticed how similar it was to the idea of natural autonomy in the German legal system, like how that could be a connection there. But ultimately, I was trying to do that exercise. And when you ask about animal agency, what that is, I try to describe agency also with phenomenology as this posture of having given meaning to something, deciding how to act in surprising manners. And the actual understanding of agency is animal agency is still open to debate. I went to Helsinki for a month, and with the aid that I received from this research group coordinated by Visa Kurki, which is called Legacy. And their object is just figuring out what legal agency is and what animal agency is. And I was able to participate, to present my research, and to participate in a workshop. And the conclusion is that we still are figuring that out, right? So I try to give some hints of what that can be if we look at animals' experiences through this embodied perspective. But yeah, so that's what I was, I guess, trying to do. And when it came to trees and plants, maybe I need to make that more clear. I am talking about animal rights. And I, of course, when I say that all animals are like included in this idea of sentience, I don't mean to say that plants are animals, but I do mean to say that perhaps they are in this way that I'm talking about sentient, because sunflower, right, or Darwin, when he observed those plants and how they had in his depiction a form of this agency. So I was not concerned with finding a moral line in terms of being like, right, we therefore need to give plants the same rights we have given or should be given to animals, but rather just open myself to think that, well, maybe there are issues in the ways we treat plants, but because we still have so much to learn, we don't know exactly how we should be dealing with them. But as time passes and we learn more, so Visa Kurki brought that to my attention, right? That in Finland, they have this company that's creating food out of like air, basically. So you don't need plants to do the photosynthesis and to give you nutrients. Like you don't need plants anymore. Would that change the way things are? I don't know. If we have like different technologies to deal with pesticides, would that change what we owe insects? So that's what I was trying to do. Just maybe there are moral issues there, but that doesn't mean that we can or should respond to them as of now, right? So that's what I was trying to do there. But I spent a lot of time trying to find that line, and I realized that it doesn't exist for me, at least in my view. It doesn't make sense to create something there. And finally, yes, anthropomorphism, that's very tricky. I guess that's also why I try to work with different sources of knowledge and for instance, ethology, right? It comes from this very traditional science, it's a scientific practices with a trial and error. But you do have ethologists, for instance, like Mark Beckhoff, and Jonathan Balcom, who work within this idea that ethology should not just be about that kind of study. It should be also about, and that's what also Vincent Desprez, who is a philosopher of ethology, says about ethology. We should not just stick to those. We need to just hear a lot of different accounts, because encountering animals is something we do on a daily basis. Mark Beckhoff suggests we do that at home, for instance, right? We practice ethology at home. So I don't think that that alone is enough, but I also don't think that ecological reports alone is enough. I think it's a conversation, and that's what I was trying to show by entangling everything there. And I think that demanded of me that creative writing and more. That's because I was trying to do something completely different. And anyway, I don't know if I responded to your comments, but yeah, thank you, and I appreciate all you said. I will try to be more clear before I publish this, and you're definitely very much responsible for my change in the final chapter, so I appreciate that too.
Hey, any further comments,
Thank you.
Professor Ach?
Thank you very much.
Okay, so co-supervisor, Professor Gutmann, could you please begin with your evaluation?
Thank you. Yeah, I gave my evaluation in my written text already, and gave in Germany the grade of summa cum laude, and the a couple of questions still left between me and so that from these questions I'd like to ask at least two. I have two follow-up questions, and I will confine myself to legal theory and say nothing about the philosophical concept. I wrote a couple of pages about that already. So my first question is, what's still open at the end of chapter 3 is the question of what forms of subjective rights can or could be granted to animals in principle, following your approach. And I am referring here to the usual discussion and differentiations following Hofeld, basic legal theory. So it's clear that there must be negative rights, defensive rights. And I guess freedoms in the Hofeldian sense, freedoms, liberties, are probably just as important, because they are rights to be left alone, to be able to behave in a manner appropriate to animals. So, however, your focus clearly seems to be on the state's, the legal system's duty to protect animals against people, against humans who abuse them or violate their interests, or what you call animal autonomy. But what about the fourth kind of legal rights, subjective rights? What about competences? Should it be possible to conclude contracts or rather agreements on behalf of animals? That was my first question. The second, I already hinted at it, my written comment. Question, of course, is, and this has a lot to do with the limits maybe of your critique of anthropocentrism, how far should or must the state's duty to protect animals go? Does it include a duty to protect animals from other animals, from predators? The lion does not practice interspecific conviviality with the lamb, and the lion does not and cannot respect the lamb's preferences. It cannot respect the lamb's basic interest-based rights. It does not and cannot respect the lamb's fundamental preference to continue living. Only humans can. So in your view, should the law have the task of breaking down the structure of the animal kingdom as a food chain? What would be the consequences of your approach taken seriously? What we should do when we talk about individual rights? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gutmann. We have talked a lot also about this very thorny issues, and they're very challenging to deal with. So I will start with the first one because it's not perhaps as thorny, or actually it is. So in this month that I was in Helsinki discussing animal legal agency, also with AI and other kinds of non-human agency, we got to discuss more precisely that to connect this with Hofeld, with power. So should animals have the power to change legal relationships, right, or their legal situations? So what I try to do, because we're still figuring that out, and that was very interesting because we had there Angie Pepper, who has a more, although she was supervised by Will Pimlica and Sue Donaldson, at first she agreed with them, but then she came to realize that she didn't think that animals actually had that power to consent and that was actually not good for them to receive like that recognition, because actually for them it would be better to be protected. And anyway, so we ended up, perhaps I ended up concluding that in my view, animals do have perhaps powers, or should receive powers at some point to change their relationships. But this would have to be very contextual and situational, and that's where phenomenology comes to play, I think, because I try to give some examples of how that applies, and to use Visa Kurti's idea of the fact that we do have in the disability studies debate and children's debate, those three paradigms, like interest, listening, and empowerment. And I didn't want to be this activist and be like, oh, it's empowerment. We need to empower. And that's not what I wanted to do at all. I really wanted to think about what made sense. And discussing this with Visa, we concluded that maybe it depends on the case. In some cases, we can have the interest paradigm playing a bigger role, perhaps in most cases. In other cases, like we saw with the Fee versus Doe, that UK case, we can have animals being heard. But the discussion is to what degree was that decision that the dog made by running back to that house determinant for that final situation? Was it normatively relevant, or did the judge listen and consider? I think the judge listened and considered other perspectives there, and then made a decision, so that could perhaps fit into the listening paradigm rather than empowerment one. But that's something that's being very fresh, right? So there's this recent book that was organized by, I guess, Will Pimlica and Donaldson, someone else. I don't remember exactly, but many papers on animal labor. And there are many different views on, can animals consent to labor, to work? How should this consent be interpreted? So Sue Donaldson suggests that microboard structure that we have for people with disabilities should be applied to animals. Would that be possible and practical? I don't think so. So how can we solve all of those things? So that's something we're beginning to discuss, and would it be good for animals to labor, right? Will Pimlica thinks that would give them social recognition, so that would be good. But I don't know, I'm not convinced. So this is something to be discussed in the next years, I guess. And it's something very much that pertains to this ideal future world where a lot has changed. A lot of the structural and the negative rights are being infringed. And I guess this aspect of agency and power, and I guess this is something to be further debated in future work by someone else, perhaps. I'm not sure. But it's very interesting. It bothers me. Maybe we'll talk about this some years from now and get to new conclusions. But as to the second point, about our duty to protect animals from other animals. So I do not think that we have a duty to protect animals from other animals, because I think that animals, they have their different community of animals. They have their own cultural and moral norms. There are many examples of how this happens, how if someone in that community acts a certain way, they are punished or they are awarded something, and strategies that they use different animals to climb the social hierarchy in that situation. So I don't think that that's up to us to discuss. I think the main problem for me is described by Val Plumwood when she talks about the issue with power. I think the way we oppress and exploit everything, how we have dominated everything in the Anthropocene, how we choose when to give birth. So that's echoing Foucault, right? We choose when animals are to be born, how many animals, when they are to die, the precise time of their death, how they are to be died and put into packages and then sold. And then I think that's very problematic, which is not to say that considering that humans, right, have our own set of morals, and we do not need to eat animals. And if we do consider as moral patients and subjects of rights humans who also might not have the same obligations towards us, like babies or very elderly people with Alzheimer's, or why would that be different with animals, right? So in our context, as humans who are dominating the world, how can we establish better relationships with them, also with that hierarchy of, I guess, responsibility and duties of care that we have? And I think that would help with creating this kind of hierarchy that is not based on quality and abilities, but rather on how we relate to one another. So like I said, Jorge and Pepe come first, regardless of anyone who's at stake. So that's, I think, what I would, how I would answer these two very complicated questions.
Okay, so the relationship, which is something I have to state, being an old-fashioned Kantian, the relationship between humans and non-human animals has to stay asymmetrical. So we can have moral duties towards animals because we can have moral duties, animals can't. So you could, if you meet the tiger in the jungle and the tiger decides to eat you, you couldn't complain that there's something unfair in the relationship, could you?
No, I could not. And I think that that's also the idea, that the problem is, again, Paul Plumwood, reducing animals to the eternal condition of being prey. So that cow was born to be prey, was raised as prey, was killed to be prey, was inseminated. So that's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, that surely makes a difference. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so last but not least, I will pose you a couple of questions. I have followed your work, Anna, from the beginning on, and so my questions are very, I have to open here my PDF, just a minute. In your thesis, you distinguish between coerced labor and situated voluntary collaboration with animals, drawing on examples like sanctuaries and everyday practices. And could you explain how this distinction might challenge current legal frameworks that define work primarily through productivity and contracts? This is my first question. And the second question is your analysis of animal trauma, especially through the lens of deprivation and cessation of playing, is very powerful. But how do you think legal or ethical debates could integrate this phenomenological notion of trauma beyond purely physical suffering? And my my last question is, and I think Professor Monticelli has already referred to that. You show how animals express grief in embodied relational ways, from elephants to orcas. How might recognizing these practices of mourning push us to rethink the boundaries of legal personhood and relational rights?
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Ana Paula, for those questions. Yeah, so the first one about collaboration in the form of work. And this is something I want to research more, animal labor, because, yeah, so first, yeah, we could bracket work, the idea of work. I briefly do that. Actually, I had written much more about animal labor, and I chose to remove it from the final version because I felt like it still needed to be processed and yeah, considered. Um, but I do think that if we turn to the feminists, for instance, and how they understand care as a form of labor, right, and how we can think of care between different animals. That's why also I wanted to bring those practices of care, because then we could consider, if we do, as Eva Meyer suggests, and learn what labor is with animals, we could consider that what animals do in their own communities is a form of labor. So I guess the question then becomes, not just this labor in this general idea of laboring, but rather having this formal job which requires this contract. And I think it's very problematic, usually with humans, when it involves this Western understanding of jobs. Because even if we do argue that animals can consent, and then we come up with structures, like again, Sue Donaldson with her microbard structure, for animals to be able to give that consent, they would have to make so many decisions every day. Like, oh, I agree with doing that today, right now, later. And the choice must be always present to them. They need to, be prepared to make those decisions. So it's a lot. And it's always an animal laboring for a human who's paying that animal. So I don't know how that could, if that could work. But I do think that if we understand that labor outside of this job structure, and think about the Guarani, for instance, then that the bees are laboring, providing in that relationship in particular, they are laboring in many different ways, but they are providing honey and pollinizing. That's the labor that's recognized and considered by the Guarani. And the Guarani are caring for the bees, and they built those structures for them, right? So in the forest, and they take care of them. So that I think is okay. We can come up with possibilities of. But I
was thinking about, and we have already discussed about that. I was thinking about, for example, the service dogs and the limits of their work. Yes, so could perhaps address that.
Yes, of course, you're right. That's perhaps the most controversial, I think, topic when it comes to animal labor, service dogs for sure. And I do think that it's problematic to reduce animals to always be and being, because they are bred, right, first, and then they are trained to act as service animals. And if they are able to achieve certain requirements, they are considered successful, and then they are sent to a home. And there's a little bit of agency in some situations where the animal needs to feel a connection with the person who is keeping that animal. But on the other hand, this animal might be sent after a little time to another home. And this animal is always paying attention to the needs of that human, and just having to, it's very demanding. And people cannot refer to the dog, you cannot communicate with them, like when they're walking the streets. So I think that there are many problems. But again, I try to show that there are ways where this could work. For instance, with Sonaura Taylor, who painted one of the paintings in my presentation. And she is this, as you know, of course, an artist with just a very severe disability that makes her need assistance and she had reserved a dog to be purchased, not to be purchased, but to be that had been bred for the purpose of being a service animal. And then she changed her mind and went to this animal shelter and chose a dog that was supposed to be killed the next day. And then she rescued this dog and Bailey, who was actually very unorthodox as a caretaker, but they were able to teach each other how to do the tasks she needed. And ultimately, Bailey developed himself a disability, and Sonata Taylor and her husband David were able to care for Bailey. So it was a much more horizontal, I guess, situation. So I guess my problem is with the whole structure of like you have this dog that is meant for this, and that's the only purpose this dog has, and the priority is always the human. I guess it's again the power difference. That would be, I guess, the first question. Now, regarding the legal understanding of trauma as something beyond suffering and how can the law respond to that? So I think that what I imagine for this, but this is something, of course, for us to think about collectively. And I was trying to do something similar to what Sue Donaldson did with her microboard suggestion, just come up with a possibility for this future ideal world, would be perhaps to have these interdisciplinary committees and with people with a lot of different experiences of living with animals. So the result would be something similar as to what we saw in chapter 2, that miscellane or that web of different perspectives, to think about what possibly could be animals' interest in general, right? Or and preferences, and then maybe at that point consider trauma through those lenses, right? So when thinking about catalogs of rights, that could take place. And on the other hand, if you're just applying the law, this could happen also in parts of law. So you could have this committee who will provide advice to the judge and who will, so I think that's, and also in concrete cases, you could have that with that dog who suffered that trauma. And again, if you have this application of this methodology, phenomenological methodology to that animal by this multidisciplinary group, that could be a way of translating, right, their perspective. So what happened in fee versus dog, but in a more organized and safe manner, perhaps. And but this is of course, I guess I wanted to give like the direction, and then we need to think about the how. And then the issue with mourning, I don't remember the question, sorry, with mourning.
I'll repeat the question. You show that animals express grief in embodied relational ways. From elephants to orcas. How might recognizing these practices of mourning push us to rethink the boundaries of legal personhood and relational rights?
Perfect. Yeah. So I was very wary of talking about mourning and some experiences that we only see in some animals, for that to be read as me arguing that animals who grieve are more relevant in any way or deserve more rights than other animals or something like that. I did not want to go back to that whole descriptive personhood idea. But I do think that when we look at different animals' relationships and I guess love and care and motherhood and grief, and how that may happen in different animals in different ways, even if the understanding of death and of losing someone is not the same. I guess I ultimately wanted to emphasize this relational aspect of vulnerability. And I think that matters because, again, like Merleau-Ponty says, man is but a network of relationships, and those alone matter to him. So intersubjectivity is so important for our experience as humans, but also as animals. And I guess if we emphasize this aspect of relationality in vulnerability and in the animal experience, we are invited to do something that the feminists say we should do, which is to give a higher focus to relationships. The law should respond and consider relationships and not just individuals when it comes to just designing law and applying law and so on. I guess that's what I was trying to do.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So we are going to keep on our procedure, and I kindly ask the audience and Anna to leave the room and rejoin us in 10 minutes. And because we are going to deliberate on Anna's grade, please.